Moving on to Lightroom Classic, those two chips are literally identical to each other. We're a few points different on the 12500, few points different on the 12500, few points different on the 12500. Here's two of the latest i5 processors from Intel, the i5 12400 and the i5 12500. To an untrained eye, they look completely identical, but if you're a creator, you might be interested in one over the other because it offers some features that probably only creators are interested in. So let's have a look at what's the difference and if you should be purchasing the 12500 over the 12400 or vice versa.
Looking for a cheap way to license your Windows? Check out Whokeys through the links in the video description. Make sure to use the code TN20 to get a 30% off. Paste the license to the activation settings and you're all done. This license is for Windows 10, but you can upgrade it to Windows 11 for free. They also offer Microsoft Office 19 license. Use the same code TN20 to get a 30% off. Check out whokeys.com in the video description below.
So then we don't usually look at the specs so much of processors, but because these two are so identical, now looking at the specs, we can really see what is the difference. So on the screen, you can see the specs both side by side, and the 12400 and 12500 in most of the cases look completely identical. The only difference over here, as you can see, is the max turbo frequency on the 12500 is 200 megahertz higher, and the base frequency on the 12500 is 500 megahertz higher. And another difference, as you can see, is the iGPU. The 12400 features the UHD 730, whereas the 12500 features the UHD 770, which is the same iGPU that we have on the 12600K, 12700K, and even the 12900K and some of the other CPUs around that area. But the execution units on the 12400 we have 24, and the 12500 has 32 execution units. But now the biggest difference here for creators or as a video editor, this is the most exciting bit for me, the multi-format codec engines, which basically just media engines inside the iGPU. On the 12400 we have only one, but the 12500 has two of them. In terms of the box and what comes with it, then my 12500 that I bought from Amazon just came in a tray, basically just the processor, nothing else. Whereas when you usually buy the 12400, it comes in a box like that. You've got a cooler and everything inside there. So when you are buying or looking at these two, make sure that your 12500, if you want to purchase this, also comes with the included cooler. If it doesn't, you're gonna have to buy a cooler separately, which will rise the price difference between those two processors even further, making the 12500 maybe not that good of a buy and getting close to the 12600K processor. In terms of the price difference between those two, it's not really a big difference. They can be like literally the same price, around $200 or something like that. But the 12500, according to Intel, should be maybe $5 to $10 or $15 more expensive. So let's have a look at if this price difference actually is worth it. For test setup for these two chips, I'm using exactly the same system, which is just behind me over there. This is the Asus Z690 ProAd build that we used, RTX 3090 DDR5, Z690 Asus creator board, super fast NVMe's, 360mm AIO. So I'm gonna leave all those specs in the description below if you want to dive deeper into the Testbench setups. In terms of the power consumption between those two, according to my testing, there's literally no difference, so I wouldn't worry about that. Cinebench R23 CPU rendering, we can see that the 12500 is 1.5% better in the single core and about 2.8% better in the multi-core. Just in case you're wondering how I'm doing my testing, all of these test results are average of multiple tests done, at least 3 tests, but often more like 4 or 5 tests, and then average of that to get really accurate performance of both of these chips. Moving on to Geekbench 5, the single core is 4% now better on the 12500, yet the multi-core score is only 1% better on the 12500. So looking at the general CPU usage, looks like the more, frequency on the boost clocks and the base clocks actually makes a difference on the 12500. Moving on to the GPU test on the iGPU, the Vulkan score on the Geekbench 5 is 7% better and the OpenCL score is 10% better. So the extra 8 execution units on the 12500 actually make a big difference, and this is right right in there with the ballpark with all the other, you know, chips from 12th gen, like the 12600K, 12700K, 12900K. Moving on to Blender and CPU rendering. Blender has just recently updated their, you know, database, so I've had to do retesting of all of my CPUs, and that's why this video might have taken a little bit longer than usual to come out. So the Monster Junk Shop and the Classroom benchmarks then. Now here, previously the lower was better, now the higher is better, because this is basically samples per minute, so the more samples you have, the better it is. 12500 is 6% better in the Monster render scene, and roughly about the same in Junk Shop and the Classroom as well. Classroom is slightly faster at 7.6% according to the 12400. Moving on to photo editing and Photoshop over here, we can see that the 12500 now suddenly looks a little bit slower than the 12400. Now, I completed the most tests on this Photoshop system here compared to all the other tests I did. I had probably about 8 or 7 tests on 12500 because I didn't believe quite the difference over here. But we can see that it's about 5% slower on the 12500 than the 12400. Now, I'm not sure what's exactly going on over here, because Photoshop updated itself slightly to like the 0.1 next version on the 12500, so I reckon that they are really neck to neck over here, but according to my test setup, this is the difference here in Photoshop. Moving on to Lightroom Classic, those two chips are literally identical to each other. We're a few points different on the 12500. The more interesting thing is that the active score, where the single core speed of a processor is more important, that's where you're working on your photos, you know, like moving the faders and doing the color grades and, you know, cropping and doing masking and all that. That's active score of Lightroom Classic. That's actually slower, about 5% or 4.3% on the 12400 compared to the 12400, which is just interesting. But the multi-core score is so much more better on the 12500 that we're making up the difference, and it's actually better overall in 12500 a little bit. I would actually probably in real world performance bet that it's actually better on the 12500 because of the single core speeds, but because of lots of different, you know, maybe some tasks were slightly doing something in the background while I was doing the 12500 in Testbench. So in real world performance, I think the 12500 is slightly faster in pretty much everything in Lightroom Classic as well. Moving on to video editing and Premiere Pro. Now here, this is where it gets very interesting. The 12500 in overall extended score is about 4.7% faster than the 12400 and about 5 or 6% better in standard overall score than the 12400. And now we can really see the difference of the iGPU and the two media encoders inside. If you look at the extended live playback speed, then you can see that that's 7% better on the 12500, which is quite a measurable increase over the 12400 with very little expense on the CPU price. And the standard live playback speed, which is, you know, H.264 and H.265 encoding, playback, decoding on the timeline, is 8.6% faster on the 12500. So the media engines actually make a difference in video editing. If you're editing H.264, H.265 on the timeline, then the 12500 is a very awesome budget CPU. The rest of the parts of the benchmarks are just slightly better on the 12500, but the live standard and extended live playback is much better on the 12500. In After Effects, interestingly, the overall score was slightly slower on the 12500, about 2.2% slower, but it's very close to the margin of errors, which means that in real world performance, you're really not gonna, you know, see the difference. Well, in Davinci Resolve, the story is very much the same. The overall score is very, very similar and within the margin of error. But I do want to make a note over here that the Davinci Resolve benchmark here doesn't use a lot of H.265 codecs. But if you do use H.265 codecs on your editing workflow, then the 12500 will be a better pick, because those encoders or media engines inside the CPU will make a better and bigger difference compared to the 12400. Moving on to V-Ray, and the CPU rendering on the 12500 is about 8% faster, which is one of the biggest differences I saw over the other benchmarks. So then, in conclusion, is the 12500 worth it over the 12400? And the only people who I think will benefit from the 12500 are video editors. If you're looking for a budget CPU for video editing, and you're probably thinking, you know what, I'm gonna get a third party cooler, or I'm not going to use the included cooler on the CPU, then probably the 12500 is a good pick. Now, if the price difference between those two CPUs is more than $20, then I wouldn't buy the 12500 over the 12400. But if it's less, then as a video editor, I think you're gonna see the performance difference, and to pay, maybe 10-15 bucks to get about 8% performance difference when working at H.264 or H.265 media, then I think the 12500 is worth it. In photo editing and other benchmarks, really this is not worth it over the 12400. Yet when we're looking at the rendering scenes, then the 12500 actually is better at CPU rendering as well, because of the boost clocks and the base clocks increase on this chip. So depending what you're doing, hopefully after this video you can see which one works best for you. The 12400 and 12500, both of them very good budget CPUs, also very similar, but the choice is up to you. Which one works better in your workflow? If you want to pick them up, I'm gonna leave those two linked in the description below. Thanks guys for watching, likes if you enjoyed it, subs if you'd like to see more, and I'll meet you in the comment section below. See you soon. Bye bye.